Do you ever wonder why the United Nations exists? It feels like it's always been there. A big building in New York, a blue flag, but it wasn't always there. It was born from something. It was a direct answer to the most destructive event in human history. The Second World War involved more than 100 million people from over 30 countries. It left somewhere around 70 to 85 million people dead. That number is so big, it's hard to even imagine. The war also created the largest refugee crisis ever seen, with over 60 million people forced from their homes in Europe alone. How do you clean up a mess that big? How do you make sure it never ever happens again? The leaders who survived the war weren't just thinking about peace treaties. They were thinking about building a whole new system, a system to prevent war, to rebuild countries, to feed the hungry, and to define what it means to be human. Every piece of the UN, from its famous Security Council to its food programs, is a direct scar from that global conflict. It's a map of the problems the world faced in 1945. So what were the specific experiences, the hard lessons learned in the rubble and ruin that led directly to the UN's creation? Number 16, could we cooperate for peace like we cooperated for war? The sheer scale of the Allied war effort was something the world had never seen. It was a brutal but effective lesson in international cooperation. There are nations that were once rivals, like the United States and the Soviet Union, found a way to work together. They coordinated military strategy on a global scale. They shared intelligence. They pooled scientific resources. Think about the logistics. The Lend-Lease program, started in March 1941, was a massive undertaking. The United States sent over $50 billion in supplies, that's over $700 billion in today's money, to more than 30 countries. Ships, planes, food, and fuel crossed oceans under constant threat. This required an incredible level of trust and shared purpose. This wasn't just a loose alliance, it was a deeply integrated global machine built for one purpose. The Combined Chiefs of Staff, a body that included top military leaders from the US and Great Britain, met constantly to make decisions that affected battlefronts thousands of miles apart. This was a new way of doing things. In previous wars, allies often fought separate campaigns. This time, the planning was truly global. When the fighting stopped, a powerful question emerged. If we can build such a complex, expensive, and effective system for waging war, why can't we build one for maintaining peace? The machinery of cooperation was already there. The relationships, though strained, had been forged in crisis. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the U.S. president, was a key driver of this idea. He saw the Allied coalition not just as a temporary military necessity, but as a blueprint for a post-war world order. He often referred to the Allied group as the United Nations long before the organization was formally created. The term was first used in the Declaration by United Nations on January 1st, 1942, where 26 nations pledged to continue fighting together. This declaration was a crucial psychological step. It turned a military alliance into a political one with a shared vision for the future. The experience of the war showed that sovereign nations could, when faced with a great enough threat, cede some of their decision-making to a collective body for the common good. The UN was a direct attempt to institutionalize that wartime cooperation. The goal was to take the urgency of war and apply it to the problems of peace. The UN Security Council, with its permanent members, was a direct descendant of the wartime leadership of the major Allied powers. The idea was simple and powerful. The same countries that had the power to win the war had the responsibility to secure the peace. The war provided a painful but undeniable proof of concept. Global cooperation wasn't just a philosopher's dream. It was possible. It had been done. The challenge now was to make it last. But how much of that wartime cooperation was based on a common enemy, rather than a common ideal? Were the seeds of future conflict already planted in the very alliance that won the war? What classified agreements made during the war meant to foster trust actually guaranteed future mistrust? Number 15, what do you do when one bomb can destroy a city? The world changed forever in the summer of 1945. The successful development and use of atomic weapons introduced a new kind of fear. Before this, war was about armies and navies. It was about territory gained and lost. It was devastating, but there were limits. The atomic bomb removed those limits. Suddenly, humanity had the power to cause its own extinction. This wasn't science fiction anymore. It was a terrifying reality. The scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project were among the first to grapple with this. Many of them, like J. Robert Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein, were horrified by what they had helped create. They immediately began campaigning for international control of this new power. They understood that a world where multiple countries had these weapons would be a world living on a knife's edge. This existential threat gave a new desperate urgency to the creation of the United Nations. The discussions at the San Francisco conference to draft the UN Charter happened before the bomb was used. But the top leaders knew it was coming. The knowledge of this impending power shaped the final debates. After the world saw the devastation, the need for the UN became blindingly obvious. It was no longer just about preventing another world war fought with tanks and planes. It was about preventing the end of the world. The very first resolution passed by the UN General Assembly in January 1946 created the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission. Its goal was to figure out how to control this new technology. It proposed the elimination of all atomic weapons and the use of nuclear energy only for peaceful purposes. The Baruch Plan, proposed by the US in 1946, was a serious attempt to put all nuclear materials and technology under international control. It called for a new international agency with the power to inspect any country's facilities to ensure they weren't building weapons. The plan ultimately failed because of deep-seated mistrust between the US and the Soviet Union, but the effort itself shows how central the nuclear threat was to the UN's early mission. The war's final act created a permanent shadow under which the new organization had to operate. The UN became the primary, and perhaps only, forum where rival powers could talk instead of fight. It was a place to manage the cold dread of mutually assured destruction. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, an autonomous body within the UN system, was eventually established in 1957. It was a direct descendant of these early panicked efforts. The experience of creating and using the bomb forced a radical rethinking of what international security meant. It wasn't just about borders anymore, it was about survival. But what if the bomb had been ready a year earlier? Would the UN have been structured differently with even more power given to a central body out of sheer terror? How many secret, informal conversations between scientists on opposing sides tried to warn the world, and were those messages ever delivered? Number 14, can an empire that fights for freedom still keep its colonies? The Second World War was full of contradictions, and one of the biggest was about empires. Countries like Great Britain and France were fighting against aggressive expansionism and for the principle of national sovereignty. Yet, both were vast colonial empires ruling over millions of people without their consent. This hypocrisy was not lost on the people living in those colonies. Millions of soldiers from India, Africa, and Southeast Asia fought and died for the Allied cause. They were told they were fighting for freedom. After the war, they naturally began to ask, what about our freedom? The war shattered the myth of European invincibility. The rapid fall of Singapore in 1942, for example, was a huge psychological blow to the British Empire. Colonial subjects saw that their rulers could be defeated. The war also exhausted the colonial powers. They were economically ruined and lacked the will and the resources to maintain their vast empires against a rising tide of nationalism. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Roosevelt and Churchill in August 1941, became a key document. One of its main points was the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. Churchill later claimed this only applied to the countries in Europe, but the message had already spread across the world. Leaders of independence movements used the Allies' own words against them. This created a huge problem for the architects of the post-war world. How could they build an organization based on self-determination while some of its key members were still colonial powers? The creation of the United Nations had to address this. The result was a compromise, the UN Charter's Chapter 11, the Declaration regarding non-self-governing territories. It was the first time in history that an international document formally recognized the interests of colonized peoples. It stated that the ruling countries had a sacred trust to promote the well-being of their territories. More directly, the UN created the Trusteeship Council. Its job was to oversee the transition of former colonies, specifically those taken from the defeated powers, towards self-government or independence. It was a system designed to dismantle empires slowly and carefully, while some, like the Soviet Union, pushed for a much stronger anti-colonial stance. The very existence of these provisions in the UN Charter was revolutionary. It put the issue of colonialism on the permanent international agenda. The UN became a forum where newly independent nations could voice their concerns and where independence movements could plead their case. The war experience directly fueled this. It created a moral and practical crisis for colonialism that could no longer be ignored. The UN was the vehicle designed to manage its decline. But did the colonial powers secretly agree to create the Trusteeship Council as a way to slow down rather than speed up the process of independence? How many independence leaders were quietly threatened or sidelined during the UN's formation to protect imperial interests? What promises of freedom made to colonial soldiers in the heat of battle were deliberately broken once the war was over? Number 13, should the small countries get a voice? The war was dominated by the Great Powers. The United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain made the big strategic decisions. Then China was also included as one of the four policemen, a term coined by President Roosevelt. This was the reality of power politics. But the war also involved dozens of smaller nations. Countries from Brazil to Australia, from Norway to the Philippines contributed soldiers, resources, and territory. They suffered invasions and occupations. They paid a heavy price. When it came time to design a new world organization, there was a major debate. Should the new body be run exclusively by the big powers who won the war? Or should every nation, no matter how small, have a say? The experience of the war showed both sides of the argument. On one hand, the failure of the League of Nations was blamed partly on the fact that it gave every member an equal vote, leading to paralysis. The major powers were unwilling to be bound by the decisions of smaller states. On the other hand, ignoring the smaller nations felt unjust and would likely lead to them being used as pawns in future conflicts, just as they had been before the war. The solution was a two-part structure. This is the UN we know today, first the Security Council. This was the core of the Great Power idea. The five main victors of the war, USSR, UK, China, and later France, were given permanent seats and the power of the veto. This was a pragmatic, even cynical recognition of reality. The UN could not take serious action on security matters without the agreement of the world's most powerful countries. The veto was the price of their participation. Without it, they simply wouldn't have joined. But then there was the General Assembly. This was the answer to the concerns of the smaller nations. In the General Assembly, every member state gets one vote. The Republic of Nauru has the same voting power as the People's Republic of China. This created a global forum, a town hall of the world, where any country could raise an issue, make its case, and be heard. While its resolutions are not legally binding in the way Security Council resolutions are, they carry significant moral and political weight. This structure was a direct result of the war experience. The war had been a lesson in the importance of both power and principle. The Security Council acknowledged the power. The General Assembly acknowledged the principle. The negotiations at the 1945 San Francisco Conference were intense on this point. Delegates from smaller countries, led by figures like Herbert Veer out of Australia, fought hard to ensure the General Assembly had meaningful powers and wasn't just a talking shop. They succeeded in broadening its mandate to discuss any issue within the scope of the Charter. The war demonstrated that a stable peace needed both the muscle of the strong and the consent of the many. The UN's bicameral structure was the ambitious and perhaps imperfect attempt to balance those two realities. But how close did the great powers come to creating a UN with no General Assembly at all, a simple military alliance of the victors? Were secret deals offered to smaller countries to get them to accept the veto power of the permanent five? Is the General Assembly's moral authority a real force or just a comforting fiction that masks the raw power of the Security Council? Number 12, how do you stop a war before it starts? The years leading up to the Second World War were a slow-motion disaster. One country after another engaged in acts of aggression. Territories were annexed, borders were violated, international treaties were ignored. The world watched, but it did not act decisively. The League of Nations, the international body created after the First World War, was supposed to prevent this, but it failed. It had no power to enforce its decisions. It could pass resolutions and impose economic sanctions, but it had no army. When a major power decided to defy the League, there was nothing the League could do. This failure was seared into the minds of the leaders planning the post-war world. The experience of the 1930s was a clear lesson talking is not enough. You need teeth, you need a mechanism with the power to enforce peace. This was the central idea behind the UN Security Council. Unlike the League Council, the UN Security Council was given real power under the UN Charter. Chapter 7 of the Charter is dedicated to action with respect to threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression. This chapter gives the Security Council the authority to take measures ranging from economic sanctions to full-scale military intervention. It allows the Council to call on member states to contribute troops to UN-led forces. This was a radical departure from the past. The plan was to create a permanent global security system. The four policemen concept, championed by Roosevelt, was the origin of this. He envisioned the major Allied powers acting as global guarantors of peace, using force, if necessary, to stop aggressors in their tracks. This evolved into the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The veto power, while controversial, was part of this logic. The thinking was that it was better to have a system that could be paralyzed by a great power disagreement than to have a system that tried to force a great power into a conflict against its will, which would simply lead to another world war. The UN was designed to prevent wars between small countries and to be a forum to prevent wars between the big ones. The direct experience of unchecked aggression in the 1930s was the single biggest driver for creating a stronger security body. As the British official Gladwin Jebb, a key architect of the UN, later wrote, the primary goal was to prevent a third world war. Everything else was secondary. The entire structure of the Security Council, its permanent members, its veto power, and its authority under Chapter 7 was a direct and deliberate answer to the catastrophic failure of the international community to stop the Second World War before it began. But was the veto a necessary evil to get the great powers on board, or was it a fatal flaw that guaranteed the UN would be powerless in the face of their own aggression? How many alternative models for an international enforcement body were seriously considered and then buried in committee rooms? Did the architects truly believe the 5 permanent members would act as selfless global police, or did they know they were just formalizing a new global power structure? Number 11, who are the world's police? During the war, it became clear who was running the show on the Allied side. The leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, often called the Big Three, made the critical decisions. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met at conferences like Tehran and Yalta to shape military strategy and, crucially, to start planning the post-war world. And Roosevelt had a very specific vision for how to keep the peace after the war was won. He called it the Four Policemen. The idea was that the 4 major Allied nations, the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, and China, would act as the enforcers of global security. They had the military might, and they would have the responsibility to act together to stop any future aggressor. This wasn't a fuzzy, idealistic concept. It was a hard-nosed, practical plan based on the reality of power. Well, Roosevelt believed that only these 4 nations had the industrial and military capacity to enforce a global peace. He discussed this idea extensively with other leaders throughout the war. The concept was first publicly hinted at in the Moscow Declaration of 1943, which recognized the need for a general international organization, but also emphasized the role of the major powers in maintaining security. This for policemen concept was the direct ancestor of the UN Security Council's permanent membership. When it came time to draft the UN Charter at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in 1944, this idea was the foundation of the security structure. The 4 policemen became the 4 sponsoring powers of the conference. France was later added as a 5th permanent member, largely at the insistence of Britain, to have another European power to balance the others. This elite group was given the special privilege of permanent seats on the Security Council and the right to veto any substantive resolution. This was a direct translation of their wartime status into a formal, permanent international structure. The experience of the war had shown that when these powers agreed, they could achieve incredible things. It also showed that if they disagreed, the world was in trouble. The UN structure was built on the hope that this wartime alliance could be continued in peacetime. It was a bet that the common interest in preventing another global catastrophe would outweigh their other rivalries. The entire concept of a small, powerful council at the heart of a larger global organization came directly from the practical experience of how the Second World War was managed and won by a small concert of great powers. But was Roosevelt's inclusion of China as one of the four policemen a realistic assessment of its power, or a strategic move to have an ally in Asia against the Soviet Union? How much did personal relationships between the big three influence the final structure of the Security Council, a structure the world still lives with today? Did they ever discuss a mechanism for removing a policeman that went rogue? Number 10, can a country be a criminal? Before the Second World War, the concept of international justice was weak. War was seen as a political act between states. The idea that national leaders could be held personally responsible for acts of aggression or for how they treated people within their own borders was not widely accepted. Sovereignty was king. What a government did to its own people, or even to people in conquered territories, was largely considered its own business. The war changed that completely. The sheer scale and systematic nature of the atrocities committed by the aggressor nations shocked the conscience of the world. As Allied forces moved across Europe and Asia, they uncovered evidence of horrors that were difficult to comprehend. And it became clear that simply ending the war and signing a peace treaty would not be enough. There had to be a reckoning. There had to be justice. This led to a revolutionary idea, the creation of international military tribunals to prosecute individuals for new categories of crimes. The London Charter of the International Military Tribunal, agreed upon in August 1945, defined 3 new types of offenses: crimes against peace planning and waging an aggressive war crimes, violations of the traditional laws of war, and crimes against humanity. This last one was the most radical. Crimes against humanity included acts like murder, extermination, and enslavement when committed against any civilian population, even a state's own citizens. This was a direct assault on the traditional idea of absolute sovereignty. The subsequent trials held in cities like Nuremberg and Tokyo put these new legal principles into practice. High-ranking government and military leaders were put on trial, not by their own country, but by an international body. This experience had a profound impact on the development of the United Nations. It established the principle that individuals could be held accountable under international law. It created a powerful precedent for the idea that some crimes are so heinous they are an offense against all of humanity. The UN General Assembly affirmed the principles of the London Charter in 1946. This laid the groundwork for future developments in international law, including the Genocide Convention of 1948 and the eventual creation of the International Criminal Court. The war forced the world to confront the reality that states and the people who lead them can be criminal. The UN became the guardian of this new legal and moral framework, a framework born directly from the need to find a just response to the unprecedented crimes of the war. But how much of this new legal framework was victor's justice, created after the fact to punish the defeated? Were there serious debates about applying these same standards to actions taken by the Allied powers during the war? What legal arguments were made at the time against the very idea of an international tribunal, and have those arguments disappeared, or are they just dormant? Number 9, what rights do all humans have? The ideology of the aggressor nations in World War II was built on a foundation of profound disrespect for human life. It was based on the idea that certain groups of people were inferior and had no rights. This led to systematic persecution, forced labor, and mass killing on an industrial scale. War was not just a conflict over territory, it was a conflict over the very definition of humanity. As the world learned the full extent of the concentration camps and the genocidal policies, a powerful consensus emerged. Never again could a government be allowed to strip people of their humanity and their rights with no international recourse. The idea of human rights was not new, but the war gave it a terrible, undeniable urgency. Before the war, how a state treated its own citizens was protected by the shield of national sovereignty. The war shattered that shield. It showed that a government that systematically abuses its own people is a threat to international peace and security. This was a core lesson. In the preamble to the UN Charter, the founding nations declared their determination to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small. This was not just rhetoric, it was a direct response to the ideologies they had just defeated. The UN created the Commission on Human Rights in 1946. Its first and most important task was to draft a document that would define the rights and freedoms mentioned in the Charter. The Commission's chair was Eleanor Roosevelt, a tireless advocate for human rights. The result of their work was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights UDER, adopted by the General Assembly on December 10, 1948. The UDER was a revolutionary document. For the first time in history, the international community spelled out a set of rights that it believed belonged to every single person on Earth, regardless of their race, religion, nationality, or any other status. It included civil and political rights like the right to life and freedom of speech, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights like the right to work and education. Every article in the UDER can be read as a direct reaction to the horrors of the war. The right to be free from torture, the right to a fair trial, the right to seek asylum in peace, these were not abstract principles. They were born from the fresh memory of a world where those rights had been systematically and brutally denied. The war experience created the political will to do something that had never been done before, to try and define a common standard of humanity for all nations. But were certain rights included in the UDER only because of horse trading between capitalist and communist countries, each trying to promote its own ideology? How many delegates secretly believed the Declaration was an idealistic fantasy that would never be implemented? What specific documented stories of survivors of the war were read by the drafters of the UDER that directly influenced the wording of a particular article? Number 8, what happens when millions have no home? The end of the war in 1945 did not mean an end to the suffering. In Europe alone, there were more than 40 million displaced people. This number is almost impossible to grasp. They were former prisoners of war, liberated forced laborers, survivors of concentration camps, and ordinary civilians who had fled their homes to escape the fighting. They were known as displaced persons, or DPs. They were scattered across Germany, Austria, and Italy, living in makeshift camps, often in terrible conditions. They had lost their families, their homes, their countries. Many had no papers and no idea where to go. This was a humanitarian crisis on a scale never seen before. It was a problem far too big for any single country to solve. It was an international problem that required an international solution. The Allied powers created the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, in 1943, even before the war ended, to begin tackling this issue. UNRWA was a massive operation. At its peak, it ran hundreds of DP camps providing food, shelter, and medical care. Its biggest challenge was repatriation, getting people back to their home countries. They successfully helped millions of people return home. But there was a large group, perhaps over 1 million people, who could not or would not go back. They were refugees. They feared political or ethnic persecution in their home countries, which were now under new regimes. This created a new long-term problem. The experience of running UNRWA provided critical lessons. It showed the need for a permanent international body dedicated to protecting refugees. UNRWA's work demonstrated the complexity of international humanitarian aid, from logistics and fundraising to the political challenges of resettlement. This direct experience led to the creation of the International Refugee Organization in 1946, and then its successor, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNCR, in 1950. The UNRWA's mandate was built on the lessons learned from the post-war DP crisis. Its core mission to provide international protection to refugees and to seek permanent solutions for their plight was a direct continuation of the work started by UNRWA. The war created the modern refugee. And in response, the experience of dealing with millions of stateless and homeless people forced the creation of the UN's permanent structures for humanitarian aid and refugee protection. But how many internal reports from UNRWA detailed the political infighting between allied nations over which refugees to accept and which to reject, where certain groups of DPs deliberately given lower priority for resettlement based on their nationality or political beliefs? What happened to the thousands of children who were orphaned and lost in the chaos, whose identities were never discovered? Number 7, who will feed the starving? And war destroys more than just buildings and armies. It destroys the ability of people to feed themselves. The Second World War caused a global food crisis. Farmland was turned into battlefields. Farmers were conscripted into armies. Supply lines were cut by blockades and bombing campaigns. In occupied territories, food was often seized by the occupying forces, leading to widespread malnutrition and starvation. Even in countries not directly in the conflict zone, like Great Britain, strict rationing was imposed. The situation was dire. In the Netherlands, the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945 led to the deaths of over 20,000 people from starvation. In Greece, a famine during the occupation killed hundreds of thousands. In Asia, the Bengal famine of 1943, exacerbated by the war, killed up to 3 million people. This experience of global, war-induced hunger demonstrated that food security was an international issue. A famine in one part of the world could have destabilizing effects far beyond its borders. The leaders planning the post-war order understood this. They knew that a hungry world could not be a peaceful world. Desperate people are more likely to turn to extreme ideologies or conflicts. This led to the first ever United Nations conference held in May 1943 at Hot Springs, Virginia. The topic was food and agriculture. 44 nations attended. They were already planning for the peace while the war was still raging. The conference's final report stated clearly that freedom from want was a prerequisite for freedom from fear. The direct result of this conference was the creation of the Food and Agriculture Organization FAO of the United Nations in October 1945. The FAO's mission was to raise levels of nutrition and standards of living, to improve agricultural productivity, and to better the condition of rural populations. It was a direct response to the catastrophic failure of the global food system during the war. The war had shown how interconnected the world was. A disruption in one place could lead to starvation thousands of miles away. The FAO was an attempt to create a global system to manage food supplies, share agricultural knowledge, and provide early warnings of potential famines. It was a practical, tangible part of the new UN system, born from the raw and brutal experience of wartime hunger. But did agricultural exporting nations use the creation of the FAO to promote their own commercial interests under the guise of humanitarian aid? How much of the early focus was on industrial agriculture, potentially ignoring more sustainable local farming practices? What pre-war studies on global nutrition were ignored or suppressed because they conflicted with the political aims of the major powers? Number 6, how do you stop a pandemic in a world at war? War and disease have always been partners. The mass movement of troops, the breakdown of sanitation in bombed out cities, and the malnutrition that weakens immune systems all create perfect conditions for epidemics. The Second World War was no exception. There were major outbreaks of diseases like typhus, which thrived in the crowded and unhygienic conditions of ghettos and camps. A massive typhus epidemic in Naples in 1943 was only controlled by a huge public health effort by the Allied military. Malaria was a major threat to troops fighting in the Pacific and in Italy. Public health systems across Europe and Asia collapsed. Doctors were killed or conscripted, hospitals were destroyed, and medical supplies were non-existent. This experience demonstrated the urgent need for international cooperation in public health. A disease outbreak in one war-torn country could quickly spread across borders, carried by soldiers, refugees, and transport ships. Just like with food and refugees, it was clear that health was an international problem that no single nation could solve on its own. The pre-war international health organizations were weak and fragmented. The war showed they were completely inadequate. In 1943, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, was given a broad mandate that included preventing epidemics. UNRWA's health division did incredible work carrying out mass vaccination campaigns for diseases like smallpox and diphtheria. They helped rebuild hospitals and trained local medical staff. They established quarantine systems to try and control the spread of disease as millions of displaced people began to move across Europe. Large-scale international health operation was a trial run. It showed what was possible when nations worked together on public health. The lessons learned by UNRWA directly informed the creation of a new permanent global health body. At the San Francisco conference in 1945, delegates from Brazil and China proposed the creation of an international health organization. This led to the establishment of the World Health Organization, WHO, in 1948. The preamble to the WHO's constitution states that the health of all peoples is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security and is dependent upon the fullest cooperation of individuals and states. This was a direct lesson from the war. The WHO was given a much broader mandate than any previous health body, including combating epidemics, promoting nutrition and sanitation, and setting global health standards. The experience of fighting disease amidst the chaos of a world war made the creation of a powerful, centralized global health authority seem not just like a good idea, but an absolute necessity for survival. But how many medical experiments, conducted during the war in the name of military necessity, crossed ethical lines and were later covered up? Did commercial pharmaceutical companies influence the early priorities of the WHO to favor their own products? Were traditional and non-Western medical practices deliberately excluded from the new global health framework? Number 5, what happens when the world's economy breaks? Many historians argue that the Second World War was really just a continuation of the first, with a 20-year pause. And what happened during that pause? The Great Depression. The economic collapse of the 1930s was a global disaster. It led to mass unemployment, political instability, and the rise of extreme nationalistic governments. Countries threw up trade barriers trying to protect their own industries. This was called economic nationalism. Each country tried to solve its problems at the expense of its neighbors. This beggar thy neighbor policy poisoned international relations and created an environment where military aggression seemed like a viable solution. Leaders like U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull firmly believed that this economic warfare was a primary cause of the actual war. He famously said, "If goods can't cross borders, soldiers will." The architects of the post-war world were determined not to repeat this mistake. They understood that a stable and prosperous world economy was essential for lasting peace. They knew they needed to create a system that encouraged cooperation, not conflict, in economic affairs. So, even as the war raged, they met to design a new global economic order. The most important of these meetings was the Bretton Woods Conference, officially the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, held in New Hampshire in July 1944. Delegates from 44 nations gathered to create a system that would promote free trade, stable currencies, and economic growth. They identified two major problems from the pre-war era. First, unstable currency exchange rates made international trade a gamble. Second, countries devastated by war or economic crisis had nowhere to turn for help, making them vulnerable to collapse. The solutions they created were two powerful new institutions. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, was established to ensure the stability of the international monetary system. It would help countries manage their exchange rates and provide them with temporary loans to overcome balance of payments problems. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, now part of the World Bank, was created to provide loans for rebuilding war-torn economies in Europe and Asia. These institutions, which are now specialized agencies of the United Nations, were a direct response to the economic chaos that was seen as a root cause of the war. They were built on the lesson that economic interdependence managed through international cooperation was a powerful force for peace. The war experience proved that allowing the global economy to descend into chaos and nationalism was a recipe for catastrophe. But was the Bretton Woods system primarily designed to establish the US dollar as the world's dominant currency, giving America a huge economic advantage? How much did the interests of international bankers, rather than the needs of ordinary people, shape the final rules of the IMF and World Bank? And what alternative economic models, perhaps less focused on free market capitalism, were proposed and dismissed at the conference? Number 4, can a country choose to do nothing? In the years after the First World War, the United States adopted a policy of isolationism. Many Americans felt that their country had been dragged into a European conflict that wasn't its business. They had lost soldiers and gained little. The U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and refused to join the League of Nations, the very organization its own president, Woodrow Wilson, had championed. Throughout the 1930s, as aggressor nations began to expand in Europe and Asia, the U.S. passed a series of neutrality acts. These laws were designed to prevent the country from becoming entangled in another foreign war. They made it illegal to sell arms or lend money to nations at war. The prevailing mood was America first. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, shattered this illusion. was a brutal and direct lesson that oceans could not protect the United States from a global conflict. The war demonstrated in the starkest possible terms that in an interconnected world, isolationism was not a viable long-term strategy. The security of the United States was directly tied to the security of the rest of the world. This profound shift in American thinking was crucial to the creation of the United Nations. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and other leaders were determined that the U.S. would not make the same mistake twice. They knew that a new world organization would be doomed to fail, just like the League of Nations, without full and active American participation. The U.S. government led the process of designing the UN. The key conferences at Dumbarton Oaks and San Francisco were held in the United States. The UN headquarters was built in New York City. This was all a very deliberate and symbolic break with the isolationist past. The experience of being drawn into the war against its will convinced a generation of American leaders that it was far better to be actively involved in shaping world events than to wait for them to arrive violently on your doorstep. The U.S. emerged from the war as the world's dominant economic and military power. Its decision to abandon isolationism and embrace internationalism, a decision born directly from the experience of the war, was perhaps the single most important factor that made the creation of the United Nations possible. But how much of America's new internationalism was driven by a genuine desire for global peace, and how much was a calculated move to secure its new position as a global superpower? Were there powerful political figures who continued to advocate for isolationism even after Pearl Harbor, and how were they silenced? Did the U.S. use its newfound leadership to design a UN that would primarily serve American interests? Number 3, how do you rebuild an entire continent? Physical destruction of the Second World War is hard to overstate. Cities like Warsaw, Dresden, and Hiroshima were almost completely erased from the map. London was scarred by the Blitz. Across Europe and Asia, bridges were down, railways were destroyed, ports were in ruins, and factories were rubble. The very infrastructure of modern life had been dismantled. This was not just a humanitarian crisis, it was an economic one. How could countries trade when their ports and railways were gone? How could people work when their factories were destroyed? The scale of the damage was far beyond what any single nation could hope to repair on its own. The initial relief efforts were handled by military authorities and then by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA. UNRWA delivered food, medicine, and emergency supplies, but this was just a temporary fix. The bigger problem was long-term reconstruction. This experience of continent-wide devastation led to a new kind of thinking about international aid. It wasn't enough to just provide charity. A coordinated international plan was needed to rebuild economies. This was the logic behind the creation of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, which later became the World Bank. As established at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the reconstruction part of its name was key. Its first loans were not for development in poor countries, but for rebuilding the shattered economies of Western Europe, like France and the Netherlands. The Marshall Plan, a massive U.S. aid program for Europe launched in 1948, operated on a similar principle. While not a UN program, it shared the same DNA, the understanding that stability and peace depended on economic recovery, and that recovery required a massive, coordinated international effort. The UN also created regional economic commissions, like the Economic Commission for Europe, ECE, in 1947. The ECE's initial task was to coordinate the reconstruction of the European inland transport system. It brought together experts from different countries to figure out how to rebuild the rail lines and roads that cross the continent. The war had shown how to destroy a continent. The experience of staring into that abyss forced the creation of new international tools designed specifically for the task of rebuilding one. But did the focus on rebuilding industrial capacity in Western Europe come at the expense of aid to former colonies or nations in the developing world? How much of the reconstruction aid was tied to political conditions forcing recipient countries to align with the West? Were there alternative plans for reconstruction that focused more on local, community-led initiatives rather than large-scale industrial projects? Number 2, can words on paper prevent a war? The single most direct cause for the creation of the United Nations was the failure of its predecessor, the League of Nations. The League was born from the ashes of the First World War with the noble goal of preventing another such conflict. It was a bold experiment in collective security, but it failed. And its failure was a key part of the experience that led to the Second World War. The leaders who planned the UN had a very clear and recent example of what not to do. They studied the League's weaknesses and tried to correct them in the new UN Charter. What were those weaknesses? First, the League lacked universal membership. The United States never joined, which robbed the organization of the world's rising power. And Germany and Japan left in the 1930s. The League became a club of like-minded nations rather than a truly global body. The UN's founders made universality a core principle. Second, the League's covenant required unanimous decisions for any significant action. This meant any single member could veto a resolution leading to constant gridlock. The UN Charter, while giving the veto to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, allowed for majority voting on most other matters. This was seen as a more practical, if less idealistic, solution. Third, and most importantly, the League had no enforcement mechanism. It could condemn aggression, but it had no military force to back up its words. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, or when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League was powerless. This was the fatal flaw. The UN Charter in Chapter 7 directly addressed this by giving the Security Council the authority to authorize military action. The entire structure of the UN can be seen as a point-by-point response to the failures of the League. The very term United Nations, first used by Roosevelt in 1942, was meant to signal a more robust, action-oriented alliance than the deliberative and often paralyzed League. The experience of watching the League of Nations stand by helplessly as the world slid into war was a searing lesson. It taught the world's leaders that a simple promise to, and never again, was not enough. You needed a structure, you needed power, and you needed the commitment of the world's strongest nations. The UN was the second draft, the attempt to get it right this time. But in correcting the League's weakness of unanimous voting, did the UN create a new weakness by giving 5 countries permanent veto power, essentially placing them above the law? Was the League's failure inevitable, or was it caused by a simple lack of political will from its key members? What if the US had joined the League? Is it possible that a Second World War could have been avoided entirely? Number 1, was it all just about preventing another war? After everything, the ruined cities, the displaced millions, the new and terrifying weapons, the single overwhelming driver behind the creation of the United Nations was the prevention of a third world war. Every debate, every clause in the Charter was haunted by the memory of the conflict that had just ended. The war was an experience that touched every person on the planet in some way. It proved that the old system of sovereign states, secret alliances, and power politics was no longer sustainable in an industrial age. The scale of the killing and destruction was simply too great. The world had come too close to the edge. The war was a total war. It erased the distinction between soldier and civilian. It showed that a conflict starting in one corner of the globe could rapidly engulf the entire planet. This experience of a truly globalized conflict demanded a truly global solution. The United Nations was that solution. Its primary purpose, stated in Article 1 of the Charter, is to maintain international peace and security. Everything else, economic cooperation, human rights, humanitarian aid, was seen as a means to that end. A prosperous world is less likely to go to war. A world that respects human rights is less likely to produce aggressive regimes. A world that can manage refugee crises and famines is a more stable world. The UN system was a comprehensive approach to peace, based on the hard-learned lessons of the war. It was an acknowledgement that peace was not just the absence of fighting, it was the presence of justice, opportunity, and law. The war showed the worst of what humanity was capable of. The creation of the UN, just months after the fighting stopped, was a desperate and audacious attempt to institutionalize the best. It was an act of hope built on a foundation of memory and fear. It was a declaration that the experience of the Second World War was so catastrophic, so absolute in its devastation, that humanity had to find a new way to live together. But did the founders truly believe they could end war, or were they just trying to create a system to manage it and keep it from becoming global? Has the UN actually prevented a third world war? Or have we just been lucky? What would the world look like today if the leaders in 1945 had simply given up and gone home, concluding that humanity was doomed to repeat its mistakes forever?